David Hundeyin is a writer, award-winning investigative journalist, founder of the excellent West Africa Weekly, and I'm glad to say he's back on the mother of all talk shows. David, welcome back. Been too long since we saw you, but we have made our turn to Africa, announced in the last few weeks. So we will be doing far more on Africa and hoping to pick your brain as often as possible. And may I do so first off on the new president of Ghana. For those of us of a certain age, Ghana is a very significant place indeed. The president, Kwame Nkrumah, was a very great icon of the Bandung era, of the immediate post-colonial era. I myself knew Jerry Rawlings, half a Scotsman. Indeed, he was. I like to keep a weather eye on Ghana. And I note that the new president of Ghana is, well, he looks to me like a lot better than the guy that went before him. Have I got that wrong, do you think?
So, well, obviously that depends on whose perspective. Certainly, I think from the perspective of what is perceived as the general interest of Africa, I think you would have to say that's a fair comment. The new president, John Mahama, seems to be, first of all, a lot more aligned with his neighbors. As you may or may not know, the previous president seemed to go out of his way to pick a fight with his immediate neighbors. That's Burkina Faso, as a result of their exit from the ECOWAS bloc. And it was almost as if these two countries, which, bear in mind, don't even have a functional border between them. It's a notional border. It doesn't actually exist. And it almost seemed as if he was trying to provoke a conflict at a stage, which, needless to say, West Africa needs that like he needs a bullet to the head. But John Mahama, even from day one, you could clearly see that there's a change in direction. So, for example, the president of Burkina Faso was actually invited to his inauguration, and he actually made the trip. That was very significant because that is Ibrahim Traore's first international trip within Africa outside of the AES bloc since he came into power. So that on its own was quite a statement, that whereas the previous president was going to the French president, going to a US delegation and basically reporting his next door neighbors and accusing them of being puppeted by the Wagner group or whatever, in a way that, caused a really obvious diplomatic fissure between Ghana and Burkina Faso. The new guy seems to have done a complete 180. I mean, it's not set in stone, by the way. He hasn't, made any actual foreign policy decisions that have been gazetted yet. But it's very clear to see that there's been a change in body language. There's been a warming of relations, and I think that can only be good news for West Africa and for the world, really.
Now, I keep reading, indeed, I've read it so many times, I flick past it now, that France is being ordered out of here, there, and everywhere, and I see what are stock pictures of French soldiers getting on planes and so on. And the Burkina Faso is at the center of a cluster of countries now, former French colonies, that do seem to have toughened up their attitude to their former colonial masters. Is that being oversold, or is it real?
It is real. It is very real. The one caveat to that is part of this newfangled exodus of French presence from West Africa is also partially driven by France itself. Because I think the French establishment has finally, belatedly realized that this growth of pro-sovereign sentiments across the region is not temporary. It's not a flash in the pan phenomenon. It's not going away. It's real. And that sort of staring down their noses at Africa and saying, you don't know what you're talking about, isn't going to cut it anymore with the generation of Africans that exist. They finally belatedly realized that. So they're, as I put it to someone I was speaking to the other day, they're moving away from direct colonization to their first proper attempt at neocolonialism. Because let's be very clear about this, the French have no intention of stepping away from West Africa. The French have no intention of letting go of their economic and political grip on West Africa. Without that stranglehold that the French government has on 14 African countries, France will be basically Portugal. It would not be what you would class as a world power. It simply would not be. The entire reason why France is in a position of power that it really has no right to be by geography, it's because of its hold on those 14 African countries. And France has no intention of letting go of that grip. So what the French government is trying to do at the moment is find a new method for exploiting those countries, which doesn't involve the sort of in-your-face tactics, which are no longer in fashion, because I think finally, after several decades, the Francophone bloc, well, let me not say across Africa, but at least in West Africa, has finally sort of got the message that this just isn't on. And to give you an idea of just how sort of blatant and in your face this thing was, up until a couple of years ago, so I visited Cote d'Ivoire, the economic capital Abidjan in 2021. It was quite common actually that you'd be in a car and you'd get stopped by French soldiers doing a stop and search on your car in the middle of Abidjan, right? Like a white French soldier speaking, a dialect of French which is not spoken in Cote d'Ivoire, stops your car, points an AK-47 or whatever rifle he's holding at you, and searches your car. So this isn't like a notional thing when people say that France has a military grip on those countries. It's a very real thing. It was a very sort of direct military occupation of these countries. And for a variety of reasons, partly because of the explosion of cheap internet access across the region, partly as a result of, as you mentioned, the political developments in Burkina Faso, which sort of catalyzed a wider movement. Finally, it has become a mainstream political position now that such things can no longer be acceptable politically across the region. So after spending the maybe 12 to 18 months trying to face it down and insisting that, these Africans do not know what they're talking about. Africans do not have any desire for freedom. This is something which is being driven by Russia or something. Like, Africans are just way too stupid to have such ideas on their own. These things couldn't have incubated from within the local political landscape. It must have been something that came from the Russians or Chinese or whoever. After spending 18 months doing that, the French have finally realized that this is real. This is not going away. This is not going to stop, and this is going to get worse. So now they're sort of finally rejigging their colonial architecture in a manner similar to what the British did maybe 50 or 60 years ago. And the French are finally sort of starting to execute the pivot away from direct colonialism to neocolonialism, which I suppose represents some sort of progress, but it's important not to oversell it as well. So yes, definitely there is a shift happening, but it will be very premature to say that it's a total liberation that we're witnessing. That's not the case. It's important to mention that at this point, these 14 countries still use the CFA franc, which is basically the French colonial currency, which was imposed on them. They all still use this currency, including Burkina Faso, by the way. There are plans to leave, but so far, these are still just plans, right? So if a country still has functional control over your money, then you cannot describe yourself as free, right? So, and that's just one aspect of the control that France still exerts over these people. Even in the inner workings of the civil services of these countries, at every step of the way, you have French civil servants, you have French consultants that by design have been inserted into all of these places. So basically, these countries almost cannot run without French involvement. So this sort of pivot to freedom that we're witnessing is something which still has quite a way to go. So some countries are at a farther stage of advancement than others. Some, like Burkina Faso, have already sort of figured out how to completely ring fence their government and their economy without sort of direct involvement of the French, which is good. Some like Senegal and Chad are still maybe 7 or 8 years behind that. But having said that, it's a start. It's definitely a good thing compared to the Anglophone bloc. I think it's fair to say the Francophone bloc has been deliberately kept behind by several decades compared to like Nigeria or Ghana. So it's definitely good to see. But again, there's still quite a way to go, and it will still take a lot of efforts, and there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. So it's not time to celebrate yet, I don't think.
Well, speaking as someone who spends a lot of time in Portugal, I wish all European countries were more like Portugal rather than France, but I take your point. Now, the proximate reason for our acquaintance was the scandals in Nigeria, for which you paid a very high personal price. You basically had to up sticks and leave your own country and seek sanctuary elsewhere. What can you tell us, if you're able? I don't want you to put yourself in any further trouble, but what happened to the scandals that erupted? Did they just die away? And is the fellow that we used to talk about, Tinubu, is he firmly in the saddle for the rest of his term?
So it's quite a unique situation back home in Nigeria because it's not as though the scandals died away or everyone just forgot. That didn't happen. And in fact, the legal outcome that I was pursuing the last time we spoke, which was I was in court with 6 U.S. government agencies trying to get his U.S. criminal records publicly released. So I was in court with the FBI, the DEA, the CIA, the State Department, the DOJ, and the IRS. And the FBI actually released I think they released about 1,000 pages of the 2,500 pages that they said they were going to release, and they basically redacted his name. The State Department claimed, after initially saying that they were going to release, I think, 900 pages of information, then said, well, we've reviewed our files and this is what we can give you. And they basically sent through a single document, a 19-page document, which was entirely redacted. So it was basically an insult. That's how I took it. The IRS claimed to have lost all their files and to have no records on this guy, which was, incredible. And then the DEA, which I found the most offensive, the DEA wrote, like, this is in a written court filing, which you can Google. The DEA said, based on a national security exemption, we are not going to release these files to you. And even further, we believe that while the Nigerian people have a right to know what their government is up to, that right does not extend up to knowing what their president is up to. And this is in writing, by the way. You can actually Google this. The DEA actually said in writing that 200 million Nigerians, you may have a right as a journalist to try to know what your government is up to, which is the job of a journalist. But 200 million Nigerians do not have the right to know what this individual, who is now the president, was up to before he became the president. Essentially because we own him, right? So, and then the CIA, in their own court filing, said, in so many words, due to the risk of basically outing an active agent, we are not going to, release these files, which I interpreted as basically, we own this person works for us, and we're not giving him up. So, and by the way, this is like public knowledge in Nigeria right now, because this story was quite widely reported, actually. And unfortunately, it is the case that the U.S. State Department has such a powerful grip over Nigeria at the moment that, despite the fact that this is in the public domain, this is spoken about on the streets, this is not a secret anymore. I promise. This is everywhere. It has had basically no effect, because basically this guy, he has such overwhelming control over the country that with the 2027 elections coming up, his son is actually being positioned to become the governor of Lagos, which is the country's commercial capital. So not only is he basically the mafia boss who has captured the entire country, Africa's largest country, his son is now being positioned to basically succeed him, if you know how these things go. And basically nobody seems to be able to do anything about it. And in fact, the path is being smoothened for his son. So I think this was yesterday or the day before, the Speaker of the Lagos State House of Assembly, who had ambitions of running for governor in 2027 and had publicly said so, and had publicly expressed opposition to the idea of the president's son becoming the governor, was hurriedly impeached. Like, this was like a 5-minute session and he was just impeached and replaced, and that's it. So the path is being smoothened very blatantly for the president's son to become the supremo of the country's most important city, while his dad is the supremo of the entire country. And apparently nobody can do anything about it, least of all me. So, imagine my frustration.
It might be a while before you can safely return, but it will also be a while before we'll have nothing to talk about. And I'm grateful to you, David, for coming back on the show. And go safely, please, because we'll definitely need to keep hearing from you. David Hundeyin, writer, award-winning investigative journalist, a man worthy of the name journalist, founder of West Africa Weekly. Check it out. Now, there are